Bismillah. We will begin now. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. My name is Melanie, and I'm very excited to introduce our first webinar series with the Imam Mehdi Association of Marja'iyya. Our event tonight is titled School Work and Beyond, Social Pressure in 2021. And just to give a very brief overview of our event, we will be discussing a few different levels of peer pressure on the personal, professional, and leisure level. And I'm sure we're going to go into a lot of depth into these three different topics tonight. And I would like to actually begin before I introduce our two very special panelists, Sheikh Dr Mahesar and Sister Berak Hussain. I would like to first start with the recitation of the Holy Quran by Dr. Shaykh. Whenever you are ready, if you would bless us with a few words of the Quran.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان الغوي الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إنا أعطيناك الكوثر فصل لربك وانحر إن شانئك هو الأبتر صدق الله العلي العظيم. I thought it appropriate in these nights of commemoration of Sayyidah Fatima alayha salatu wassalam to have Surah Al-Kawthar. Thank you. Please go ahead, Sister Melanie.
Thank you. And thank you for that beautiful reminder. Now I would like to introduce Sheikh Dr Mahesar, who just recited us those beautiful words of the Quran. He received his doctorate from Johns Hopkins University, and he's a specialist in he's a psychologist and environmental scientist by profession, and he specializes in the neurocardiovascular physiology and he studies the effects of air pollution on human health. And he's amongst the leaders in his fields and received the 2011 Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers from former President Barack Obama. And in addition, Sheikh Dr. Hazari, he has also completed his house of studies under the direction of His Eminence Sheikh Muhammad Ali al-Halabi, and he is also the resident scholar of the Islamic Ahlul Bayt Association of the Triangle in North Carolina, where he is deeply committed both locally and on a national level to community service, public outreach, and intra and interfaith dialogue. And as one of the members of the Council of Shia Muslim Scholars of North America, he's one of the board members of the Imam Mehdi Association of Marja'iyya, and I hope that he can contribute his knowledge here today, as I know he will. And of course, we have Sister Berak Hussain. She is a Canadian-Iraqi registered psychotherapist, and she practices at the Health and Counseling Services at Carleton University for the past 13 years, mashallah. And outside of the university level, she's also known as the Muslim counselor, and she's a very passionate speaker, as you will see today, in the Muslim mental health and social justice, domestic violence, and on also women issues, Islamic issues, and many, many more. And she has worked locally and internationally for a variety of mental health initiatives, including spearheading the Serenity Islamic Mental Health Awareness Initiative. And she's worked tirelessly to break the stigma around the topic within the community. And I know that she will share a lot of her wisdom with us tonight. And I'm sure they would like to introduce themselves, but I'm just going to jump right into our discussion today. And just to kind of lead the discussion, we're going to be breaking off of this very special acronym, which stands for Iman, I-M-A-N, and we're going to identify the different positive and negative influences leading back to our topic on peer pressure, maintain our Muslim identity, and act on our religious duties, and finally the N stands for to never compromise our religious, moral, and ethical ideals. So without further ado, we're going to be jumping into our first question I have for Sister Berak. How do we choose and surround ourselves with the right influences such as peers, social media, and with our different kind of like Muslim and non-Muslim acquaintances or circles?
Thank you very much, Sister Melanie. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Thank you for joining this insightful, inshallah, and interactive evening. And we're really excited to share our thoughts and have the interaction, inshallah, with those who have joined us. So before I get into answering this specific question in terms of how do we choose and surround ourselves with the right influence, I want to take a look at a survey that was took place in 2010 here in Canada by, see if I pronounce this right, Environics Institute for Survey Research. And what they did in this survey is they took a look at Muslims. And one of the questions they explored that I found interesting was how our religious identity and practice influenced by the Canadian context. So this is specifically North American, but Canadian. And so what was interesting to see is that Muslims were one of the most religiously observant groups in Canada, and their religious identity and practices appear to be strengthening rather than weakening, as we probably are assuming that, as their lives evolved here in Canada. So being Muslim is a very important part of their identity for most followers of Islam, and comparatively stronger than for members of other major religious groups here in Canada. And so moving to Canada here from different countries does not appear to have a secularizing effect. What we see, in fact, is that immigrants are more likely to stay or say that their attachment to Islam has grown rather than waned since arriving here in the country. What we see also, interestingly enough, is that Muslim youth, so those who are second generation Canadians around the age of 18 to 34, they stand out as being the most religiously observant generation in the Muslim community. Who would have thought that, right? With all the challenges that we hear in our community, we think it would be the opposite. But this research back in 2016 has shown that, and if the trend because the trend has increased since this study first was put out in 2006. So it's interesting to see that within the Muslim community, the youth are actually more observant. And this is in contrast with the broader trend in Canadian society, where we see that youth are turning away from organized religion. So they are most likely, what does that mean? To visit mosques for prayer on a regular basis, wear the hijab, and support the right to pray in schools. And I remember back in high school, this was something that was really supported and by the youth, both the Sunnis and the Shias in high school were really pushing for this, to have Friday Jum'ah, and even though it wasn't exactly the same time, but to have it during our lunch hour where people would gather. And so this was, I'm not going to say exactly when, but this was quite a few years ago before this survey. And we see that the trend has continued, mashallah, where we have established Muslim groups in high school and university where youth are proudly showing their Islamic, let's say, identity and showing their influence to others. So this is interesting, again, where we compare this with older Muslims, where they identify primarily as Muslim rather than as Canadian. So this is what the youth identify themselves as. And they express a slightly weaker sense of belonging to, the elders, I mixed this up. This is still with the youth, where they identify primarily as Muslim, and that they have that slightly weaker sense of belonging to the country. So they also report a higher level of discrimination and feel pessimistic about how Muslims will be treated in the future. So by comparison, we see that Muslims 60 and older, they're amongst the most integrated of generations in that they identify as Canadian more than Muslims. Again, this is something I found quite interesting because we tend to think it's the opposite. So it's quite interesting now when we take a look at that question, again, in light of this information, is how do we choose and surround ourselves with the right influences with peers, social media, Muslims and non-Muslims? I think our youth are already doing that, and we just need to bring more attention to it. So when you're in school, obviously you're going to connect with people who are Muslim and non-Muslim. And I think this is just a natural thing, is that you want to be influenced by positive energies rather than people who have that negative influence on you, right? So being aware of people who make you feel good, very connected to what you were taught, let's say at home, or Islamic studies during the weekend, or even when you attend mosque and the different organizations that you have, that they're congruent, they're not conflicting with what you were learning. And it's very challenging, of course, let's say when you are in a school where most of the influences are from non-Muslims, it's more Western type of society. And of course, right now, because of the pandemic, we're all at home, at least a lot of us here in Canada, and especially Ontario right now, we are in a lockdown. What we want to be very aware of is how we are allowing social media to impact us. So who or what pages are you following? Are these pages impacting you in a positive way or a negative way, right? Are these things going to be useful and educational, or are you just taking this and just scrolling through mindlessly for hours, or even looking at content that can impact you mentally, but spiritually as well in a negative way, right? So it's very important as a first step to be cognizant of the positive and negative influences that are out there. How do they make you feel? Do you feel good? Now, sometimes you could be looking at things that are, let's say, not appropriate religiously or morally. Do you feel good after watching that? Perhaps initially, yes, but long-term, we know that there are negative impacts when you continue watching violence, when you continue watching sexualized content, when you look at things that are just really mindless or very toxic. We know after a period of time, that can really impact you in a negative way, whether it's your behavior, whether how you interact with people. So I think a lot of us have that inner switch on and off when you are aware instinctively when something is not right. And especially if you were taught these things at home, you're taught these things at the Islamic centers, and you have that, what's the term I'm looking for? The moral button. There's a specific term, it's slipped my mind right now. If the Shaykh and the sister could help me. What was that?
The moral compass.
Thank you. That's exactly what I'm looking for. The moral compass. I think instinctively we all have that. And we know that Islamically, our beliefs are that we are born good. Yeah, and then nature is good, but then nurture, your environment around you impacts you. So it's really important as young growing minds to be aware of that, right? And look at the energies and the forces around you that are influencing you. For example, how much time are you on social media? How much time are you watching TV, binge watching TV shows? How much time are you in front of the screen? And I know during the pandemic, that has shifted dramatically because of the need to working from home, perhaps, and because people are bored or they need some kind of entertainment. They don't know what else to do, so they turn to that. But being cognizant of that, being aware of how much you're interacting using these mediums that we're not really born to do. I mean, we're more inclined to connect with nature, with people, rather than a screen, right? So it is, again, all about that awareness in terms of how your surroundings can impact you. And we know when it comes from a mental health perspective, your surroundings have a lot to do with impacting your stress levels. So that's another thing. How stressed do you feel when you are not interacting with people, but rather, you know, playing those violent games online and screaming and yelling? Have you seen your kids or your friends, or walking into a friend's house, I see her young teenage boys just screaming at the screen, killing and murder. I'm like, what are they doing? And that's entertainment, unfortunately, right? So being really aware for parents, how much time your children are in front of the screen. What are they using the screen for? Of course, it becomes really challenging to control, so to speak, or manage your teenagers' internet usage and who their friends are online, especially when people can have fake accounts and do all sorts of interesting things like that. I think it comes back to the root of having that healthy relationship with your children, that open communication, and how you connect with them and make them feel safe to come to you, but also being able to influence them. So, for example, I'll give an example of my young daughter who's turning 10. Oh my goodness, she's turning 10 this year, mashallah. And I am one of those parents who refuse for her to have an iPad or an iPhone. The reason being is because if you look at Silicon Valley inventors, they themselves, and I learned this from Sheikh Yusuf Ali a few years ago when he came to Ottawa, and the parents were not listening, of course, in the audience, but that really caught my attention, where he started talking about how developers of Silicon Valley themselves refuse for their children before the age of 16 to have any of these devices. That says a lot. If these developers themselves who created this technology refused for their own children to have this technology, that tells you right there what a negative influence that can be on your children. So perhaps, I'm a tough parent when it comes to not allowing my daughter to have this. The only time she's allowed to use it, of course, right now, working from home, she has to have her own device for school, the online learning, or she will use it for YouTube, watching Quran to memorize, looking at crafts. And again, I will monitor what kind of craft shows she's watching. And of course, we have to watch cute cat videos, because that just lifts up the oxytocin in your body, which is the feel-good hormone, things like that. And we keep it to a minimum. We play board games, we read books, and yes, we will watch useful shows. And I remember when the lockdown happened last year, immediately we started watching the Nabi Allah Yusuf series, which, believe it or not, captures all ages' imagination. So things like that. Again, being aware, right? And it's so important to be aware that of how these things make you feel, right? To be able to connect it to your identity, inshallah.
Yes, you really answered my question so well. And as you were talking, I was thinking that I asked you, how can we choose our surroundings? And I think part of my question may have been even like misguiding, because sometimes we can't necessarily choose where we go to school, but we can, like you said, we can be aware of our moral compass, and we all know our own morals. But maybe the better question would be, how can we become more aligned with our own moral compass, so then that we're not only saying that this is what we believe in, but these are the beliefs that we are practicing. I wanted to move on to our next letter of our acronym in maintaining our identity as Muslim citizens. And I do have a question for Sheikh Doctor. How do we keep a strong hold of our faith when trying to fit in and feeling pressured in our different society circles?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So one, I want to begin by thanking Sister Berak for that very, very nice answer. And indeed, I am learning as we go as well. So I consider myself really lucky to be here with both of you. And inshallah, we can learn together. So I'm going to actually piggyback off of what she just said in terms of the statistics, some of the data that she was demonstrating. And really, in all honesty, I'm a scientist at heart, and everything I look at from the viewpoint or from the focal point of data. And so I'm going to try to share with you one figure really quickly and see if you can see it. Let's see. Okay, so this figure is taken from a study done by Steinberg and Monahan back in 2007. And again, we're looking at 10 plus years. So clearly take it contextually and understand it in its relevancy to today, 2021. And it's interesting because Sister Berak made a very nice statement that in Canada, and maybe indeed here in the United States, we have this phenomenon where younger Muslims are more adherent to religion. The degree of religiosity or wanting to find themselves is greater at the younger age. Yet the data that is demonstrated here by Steinberg and Monahan, and I would assume that it tracks through the years successively as we come up to 2021, is that as youth become older and older, particularly as they reach their 20s, their resistance to peer influence actually increases. So that means something is happening between the ages of 10 and 20 that shows sort of a change in that human being. And indeed, we know from the ahadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam, and from the traditions of the Ahl al-Bayt alayhim as-salatu was-salam, that there is this gradual sort of transformation and this change in human beings. But what is it about people that makes them sort of change over that period of time? I think one is that we're so plastic at the young age, meaning we are open to all these influences. We still are developing our characters. We're developing what we know and what we believe. And it is such a sensitive age that if it's not fed the right thing at the right time, then there's the great risk of sort of faltering and falling. And I always have thought of it as a young Canadian growing up in the United States. So I'm also from the Great White North, Toronto in this case, go Maple Leafs. I also know what it feels like to have gone to high school over here and to go to college and to feel the strains of being a Muslim in a society that is secular and that where the standards of morality and ethics are not necessarily the same. And so I've always felt that there is this hill almost, this moment where you don't stop struggling, but you begin to realize who you are. And I feel like, at least for me, that was like the early 20s when I had gotten to college, finished my 4-year bachelor degree, which took me more like 7 years because I wasn't particularly smart. But needless to say, maybe that's why I was a little wiser when it came to my religion. But it's that moment where you've developed that maturity. and you start to understand things in their context. And I think that's the most important. Why do we struggle as Muslims in this society? Why is it that our youth go through these ages where they feel temptation, where they feel disconnected from society and indeed from their religion, and need time to understand? It's because there are so many forces, there are so many influences that are telling you what is right and what is wrong. And for faith to develop, you need a marker, you need road markers. But you need those road markers with clear contextual meaning, with significance. What does that mean? Meaning, I here as a Muslim growing up in America, growing up in Canada, am not going to be growing up the same way a Muslim is growing up in Iraq or in Pakistan or in Lebanon, because that environment is a different environment than mine. And what ends up happening is I'm assuming, or at least my parents assume, or those who are in my family or in my community assume, that the only way to grow up as a true Muslim is to do so by growing up the way they did in the East. And that may not be the case. And that's why when it comes to developing faith and ensuring that you can maintain who you are and what you believe in, not only do you identify the tenets of that faith and what you believe and how you implement it, it has to be implementable, but also the context in which it is applied. And I think that is a really critical thing. We suffer because I think we forget that we are human, and we forget the challenges of living in a secular society. Let me give you an example. I think many a times we struggle with the idea of temptation, right? And temptation is the one thing, whether it is generated due to physical desire, whether it is due to doubt in your mind, whether it is due to influences of peers. Temptation of any kind is what Shaitan is trying to do to push you away from the path of God. And he will use any vehicle and any means by which he can do so. And yet we find ourselves constantly in these circumstances where we ask ourselves the questions, why are we being tempted? Or even when we become tempted, we feel guilty or we feel annoyed with ourselves that why did I get tempted? And the answer to that is it's not wrong to be tempted. We are human. Allah has made us in this way. It is okay to feel temptation. I'll give you a personal example. So when I was in high school, senior year came along, and this very nice young lady, classmate of mine, asked me to prom. Now, the first thing I would say that she probably needs to get her eyes checked, because, I mean, just look at this. But really, in all honesty, when she asked, and all my friends are going to prom, everyone's buying their tuxedos and everyone's getting ready to go together. And
don't forget the limos. The limos.
The limo was one of the biggest things. It was the greatest, right? Exactly. So I was so tempted. I was so immensely tempted. And I sit back today, many, many years later, and I think to myself, it was normal for me to be tempted. It was normal because of the context in which I found myself. It would be abnormal, maybe by some sense, if I didn't feel tempted, right? Because there is a human inside of us.
So you didn't go, Sheikhna. You didn't go.
Oh, I didn't answer it yet, though.
Oh, okay. Because I want to add to that story from my experience.
Yeah, okay, good.
It reminded me. Go ahead.
Right. So I was asked. In fact, I'm not boasting, because I question these very nice young ladies' mental state by asking. It was actually two young ladies who asked me, and in both cases, I said no, and I didn't go. And in all honesty, when my friends came back the next day and told me about the wonderful time they had, I was really depressed. I was so depressed, and I was questioning myself. But do you know what? Holding on to the resolve and knowing that it was my own choice, I was very fortunate, because my father and mother were the types of parents who taught me what they needed to teach me, and then said, you have to make the choice because you have to decide what is right and wrong for you. And I chose for myself not to go. And although it was difficult at that moment, that critical choice at that moment, I think, shaped my future, shaped who I wanted to be. And I can sit back today and say, it was the best thing. Indeed, God saved me. God kept me away from the wrong. But to feel temptation is not wrong. And so to understand who we are is the best way to maintain faith. and not to be so hard on ourselves that we're constantly denigrating and scolding ourselves. All right, Sister Berak, go ahead. Let's hear what you've got.
I went to my prom.
Yeah.
Okay, but let me explain how, okay? Because I think it answers the question perfectly here. And Sheikh, had you not brought up the prom example, I don't think I would have thought it up for this here in terms of who am I, in terms of balancing, in terms of keeping our Muslim identity, yet we're living here. So the prom that we had was for the graduating students, and I went with my best friend who was a female. And what we did is I still dressed very appropriately. In fact, I think I kind of rocked my hijab in terms of respecting my hijab and still dressing nice. And I was very proud of that. I remember as a 18, 19-year-old. And what we did is we went to the dinner portion at the Canadian Museum of Civilization, which is a very respectable place. And there were people from our school there. So the principal, if I remember correctly, and whatnot. So it was chaperoned, so to speak, at least that part of the evening. And it was a very respectable dinner. And we sat at a table. I think there were mostly girls at the table, and with my best friend. And I was graduating, she wasn't, but she came with me because she knew people were going to be couples and things like that. So she came and honored me. And Caitlin Rayner, I remember her name till now. I have fond memories of how she respected our values in religion, even though she herself declared herself to be an atheist later on, I remember. Now, that was part one of the evening. And I even remember before that, yes, people had limos and stuff. We got dropped off, I think, by her parents. We went to a family home where they opened up, and there was no alcohol. I knew there was no alcohol or anything like that. Otherwise, I wouldn't have felt comfortable there. And the parents of the family, they invited us into the backyard. People were taking pictures. So there wasn't really anything haram, alhamdulillah. People were just chatting, congratulating. Some people were dressed in their traditional clothing, which I found was really nice. And like I said, I felt very proud that I still maintained my hijab and I maintained my respect. I went with a female friend. We went to the dinner, and part two is when they all went to the party afterwards, in which I said, Ma salama, and we went home, and she actually came to my house for a sleepover. So I think it is possible to find a healthy balance while still maintaining our identity. Research ahead of time. Whose place are you going? Are they going to be serving alcohol? What's going to happen at the evening? Is there going to be haram type of behavior that is going to be around that's going to be tempting for us? Alhamdulillah, researching ahead of time and letting my family know, I think I did a good job of maintaining that experience without crossing over. And I think that's really important when we take a look at that in terms of, and I think, Sister, you wanted to ask me, should I just jump ahead and go for it? In terms of the question for this, how do we balance our faith?
Yes, I was about to. That's a perfect transition. Go
yeah,
ahead.
and just in terms of how to balance our faith is, I think it requires the foundation of what our parents teach us, and as youth, what we are influenced by around us. And like the Sheikh said, to make informed decisions, what is right, what is wrong, and being tempted into things, of course. And I think it's normal and natural to have these temptations. Otherwise, how are you going to squeeze your soul, so to speak, in terms of learning and growing from things? If everything is just so easy, then you're not really learning, right? So when things are challenging on your path, that's questioning you, and that's challenging your faith and your knowledge. Another quick example that I really like to share quickly that I think talks about balancing our faith living in Western society. So I think by now you realize that I did grow up here in Canada in high school as well, but Ottawa, go Sens, go. So we and again in high school, I remember one day specifically during the lunch hour in the auditorium, there's something at that time was called air bands. I don't know what it's called now, but essentially what it is people making reenacting live music videos on stage, which means that they actually dress up like those inappropriate videos on stage with music and dancing and whatnot. So I recall walking by the auditorium, what is this loud sound? And I poked my head in, and I was quite shocked to see what was going on. People are like, come in. I'm like, I'm not going in there. What is this? Completely like, what is this? And I looked at it for a few minutes, and sure, it was tempting in the sense that people were saying, come in, have fun. This is fun. I knew instinctively, no, this is not appropriate halal fun. And I walked away. SubhanAllah, that same evening, I didn't realize my community had rented out the same auditorium for a majlis. And I remember as that 15, 16-year-old amazed at how during the day in this Western society, this is what was there as an influence. And later on that exact same evening, we had a majlis on the exact same auditorium stage. And so this is where both worlds can collide for a lot of young people, the struggle of how do you give in or how do you not give in, and how do you balance that? And I do believe it is very possible to balance that. I think now with the progression that we've had in our society, where a lot of groups in school and university have their Muslim groups, they put on all these amazing events for education, Islam awareness, Ashura awareness, women awareness. I think we do have the safe space to practice our faith. Absolutely, there are people out there who are ignorant and who will have very negative attitudes. And like we mentioned earlier, there are still Canadians who feel that they may be looked down upon because of their faith and looked down negatively, and that's because of how the media portrays. But I think there has been a huge pushback from Muslim youth and Muslims our age, where we say, no, we're taking back our narrative, and we are going to be speaking about being professionals in the community, in their workspace, but still maintaining our hijab and our identity. Another quick example, when we talk about faith and living in a Western society, is that my work, I've implemented a few times now World Hijab Day in February. And I, of course, taken permission from my boss and said, you know, how would you feel? Because a lot of people are like, oh, what's Berak going to wear next? And they've made me become very self-conscious and aware of my hijabi clothing. So I've taken it to the next level of not wearing the same outfit twice, but just because it was kind of fun to do. But at the same time, I realized they're actually watching what I'm wearing and they're commenting. That's a big deal in the fact that they're complementing also what we're wearing as modest clothing, still fashionable, so to speak, but it fits in with that balance, right? So we did that, got permission from the boss, and we did World Hijab Day, put it in the conference room. I brought all these hijabs that I didn't want any longer, some really nice ones, washed them up, got them ready, disinfected. This is pre-COVID, of course, and you know, mirrors and signs. And I printed off the information that World Hijab Day now provides on their social media, and I put those signs up and invited my colleagues, female colleagues, to come in and try on the hijab. Some of them actually kept the hijab on for the whole day. And I interviewed them as I was putting it on and talking to them, they kept it on. So you see how you can do that balance. And we're going to get to that point in a bit, but essentially the idea here is confidence in your faith, in your attire, in your professional life as well. And I know not all places are going to be open and inviting as my wonderful workplace at Carleton University, but you see how it is possible to balance that. The colleagues had a lot of fun. We had pamphlets there on hijab. They asked lots of questions, and some, like I said, kept the hijab on the entire day, and actually did a YouTube experiment on that. And if you go to the Muslim Counselor, I just remembered the World Hijab Day video. I did a whole video on with my colleagues, and it's a lot of fun to see how they integrate it. So it is possible, absolutely, to have that balance, but it requires a lot of work on your behalf, in the sense of making sure you're in the environment that is acceptable, you have your confidence, and working with like-minded people. It's not easy, but it is doable. It's all how you present yourself as well.
Yes, I love how you said that you got a lot of support from your non-Muslim friends, especially. And when they acknowledge the hijab and other like physical or external symbols of our faith, and they embrace that and support it, I feel like that is really like an overwhelming feeling of support. And I wanted to reiterate something that Sheikh said earlier. I felt it was very comforting to hear that our resistance to peer pressure is constantly strengthening. And I wanted to repeat that and emphasize that point to maybe some of our younger audience, and also to our family members, as a kind of like a way to comfort and reassure ourselves that we are like constantly growing from our surroundings. And the question, who am I and what is my purpose here? These are questions that we're always asking ourselves. And I know for me, myself, that I'm never going to stop asking that question to myself. And this will help me hold on to the most important aspects of my faith and my identity. And so I want to move on to the next question concerning how do we act accordingly? And how do we not just assume that it's okay to just feel these beliefs in our heart, but how do we practice these beliefs and really take them in our heart, but also show them externally? And I have another question for Sister Berak. When is it the right time to say no, and how do we set boundaries?
So this is definitely challenging. I'd like to hear from the Sheikh first, though, before I jump in, because I feel like I spoke too much at this point. Do you want to go, Sheikhna? Do you want to comment on that before I?
Their benefit, everyone is benefiting. I'll say this. I'll say this prior to the question that was posed to you, that we can then benefit from your answer. I think, in all honesty, there are moments we just have to be able to identify. And I think, once again, not only identify the forces that are influencing us, and I'm sort of going backwards, I know, but also the individuals who are sort of involved. Not every Muslim is the same. Not every community member thinks the same way, is influenced the same way, or feels the same pressures. Different people have different weaknesses, different people have different strengths, and hence those are the things that have to be determined. I know somebody asked me once that if I do in fact give my children an iPad or an iPhone or something like that, how do I determine and how do I know, what sort of signs do I look for to determine that they're going the wrong direction? Well, one, we should never have unfettered access to so much information. I grew up in a time when there was no internet. Really, the life was so much simpler. Today, there's so much information, and all of that information has an impact on you. So I don't think any child should have unfettered access. And particularly if there are certain children who are more susceptible, whose behavior is more susceptible. And there are, even amongst siblings, there may be one child who is a little more immune to the influences of a society, whereas another one may not be. That's up to the parents. That's up to those people who supervise or are the guardians or have sort of oversight over these children, over the youth, to be able to do so. Even as a youth yourself, I'm now speaking of kids or young people who are 14, 15, 16 years of age and older. And indeed, this applies to people who are in their 20s and 30s and people who are well beyond that as well. At what point can you say that you have true control over yourself and that you will be able to shake off the effects of whatever is around you? I think that requires 2 or 3 very important statements. One, you must adhere to the laws of your religion. There is no sort of question or gray area in that. Anything that goes outside the boundaries of what God has said to us is off limits. And that is the key. Number 2, we must be able to live a life that is moderate enough, progressive enough in the sense of how we are physically living on the ground, to say that we are going to implement our religious practices in such a way that it doesn't cause us to recoil away from society. Islam does not teach us to recoil away from society. And we're fortunate in that we live in a society where we can practice freely. We can be Muslims the way we want to be. We can dress the way we want to dress. We are respected for our behavior. We need to show the confidence in that. We need to be able to accept that for ourselves and have this self-worth as a Muslim that reflects what we believe and the strength of our belief. I think if we do that, that creates a lot of strength for us personally. And when we are faced by those circumstances that cause us to recoil, we are at least able to see them clearly for what they are and know that this is not something that's going to determine my faith, but instead is going to cause me to act in a certain manner in society only, solely. And that goes irrespective of the type of friends you have, the type of job you have, the people you surround yourself with. I say this again, that I grew up with absolutely no Muslim friends. I grew up in a time and in a place where there were no Muslims. My friends were all non-Muslims, but they were people of good households, people of good morals and ethics. And indeed, that helped. And I think to some degree that helped shape the strength of my belief. Because I think sometimes when we're surrounded by Muslims, we rely on that community and that center and that mosque to shape our belief and who we are. No, we should know that it is each one of us that's going to determine who we are as Muslims. And that is a very personal thing between us and Allah. And the only one that comes between us and Allah is our wasila, Muhammad wa ali Muhammad alayhi salatu wassalam. So with that, let's hear Sister Berak's excellent answer. And I'll completely ignore the Go Sends comment.
All right, that was a very deep philosophical, spiritual answer. And mine is very simple when it comes to this. And I think it says it all from the psychological perspective. I believe setting boundaries and saying no has to do with your self-esteem and your confidence. If that is not there when it comes to peer pressure, the need to fit in and go with what everybody else is doing and to be accepted, I think that low self-esteem and confidence has a huge role to play with that, right? Whereas, and this is something, again, that you develop over time, whether it's with your siblings, whether it is friends from the same community, or in a non-Islamic environment, or at school where you don't have much friends, like the Sheikh said, growing up, like Muslim friends. So you have the opportunity time and time again to show that confidence. But again, it's something that is built over time. Now, of course, when we're looking at bullying, when people are being very toxic and hurtful towards the fact that you wear hijab, towards the fact that you look different, towards the fact that, let's say, you're not eating at a certain time during the year, during Shahr Ramadan Mubarak, or perhaps if you're wearing all black during Muharram and Ashura and so on and so forth, you grab the attention of people who are not aware of what's happening around you, and you become easy prey to be picked upon, which is something that kids do regardless, right? So sometimes it's hard to set those boundaries in terms of just falling into the crowd and doing that. I can tell you from my personal experience growing up, I come from a very strict, conservative Iraqi Karbala'i household, where I wasn't even allowed to breathe the air around me that boys were breathing. Like, that's how strict my upbringing was with my father. And God bless him, you know, that taught me a lot in terms of boundaries and how to interact with the opposite gender, maybe not in a very healthy way as a teenager, but that's what my father knew. And that's what he felt at the time that we do. Now he sees me interacting with people of all different backgrounds and genders, and it's different now, because now it's between me and God. It's no longer my parents' responsibility, but at that time, living in their household, it was their responsibility to teach us, right? So that upbringing set the instincts to be nurtured further, that when I am out in the red zone or wherever, those the moral compass and the red flags and the alarms were flaring up, that, oh, you're breathing the same air as the opposite gender around you, so be careful how do you interact with people. I don't particularly believe it's the healthiest way, but again, this is what my parents knew, my father specifically. And to take it further, and I think a lot of cultural families, people from different ethnic backgrounds probably relate to this, where especially in the Iraqi community, I would say, perhaps I've seen this also perhaps in the Khoja community, the Pakistani, not so much with the Lebanese. So you know what I'm going to say next, the interaction between the genders and boundaries there, right? So that's something sometimes that can be blurred in terms of how we interact, right? So I grew up again in a community where I didn't know who Muhammad was from Beit Abu Muhammad until I went to university, and I'm like, oh, you're that Muhammad. That's how segregated we were, right? So that again, it sometimes it can be healthy when you're segregated, but sometimes it's not, because then out in the real world, so to speak, you do need that interaction, right? You do interact with the opposite gender. You need to know how to speak with respect, with modesty. And that falls into, again, the boundaries when it comes to how to interact with the opposite gender. Now, taking a little bit further, when we look at the influences around us, again, it comes back to, I know I went off a little bit off track here, but it is somewhat interlinked and related. Again, when it comes to our youth in terms of learning how to say no, and knowing that it's okay to say no. That doesn't make you a loser. Absolutely not. Because in the end, what you're doing is, when you fall to what others are pushing you to do, you are pleasing them rather than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I know sometimes that doesn't really make sense as a youth at a certain age in high school, when, you know, it's really important to dress a certain way, or to go to a certain party, or to connect and behave a certain way, right? Whether it is with the opposite gender, or doing acts that don't really fall into our moral compass of how we're supposed to behave. It's so tempting to let go of those boundaries and say yes and do those things, including, and let's just be very clear and open about it, including substances such as drugs and alcohol, right? That can be offered to you even close to the school grounds. or sometimes, and we know this is a fact, we've seen it, people around us who lie to their parents to go somewhere. I'm going to Fulan's house, when in fact they're going to the party where we know there is inappropriate interactions going on and there's altering substances. So these things are happening. I know it's different now during the lockdown, but sometimes for that young person to have that influence around them, it's so easy to try and please people and to be part of the cliques, to be accepted, right? Oh, that's the cool Muslim who went to the party and got drunk last weekend. And you know, it's funny, in high school, I remember hearing about those stories of the Muslims who went to such places, who then went and told the other Muslims or other people, the non-Muslims, don't let Berak know. Don't let Berak know that I went to this party and I got drunk. So I find that really interesting how these students would behave like that, when in fact, why are they afraid of what I have to say and think when Allah is watching them, right? But they went along. They did not set their boundaries. They went along with what people wanted of them to do to fit in and be cool. But, and I think, again, when we come back to it, I think it's the solid foundation of what our parents, what they can do in terms of showing the love for the religion, showing the love for our culture and history and so on and so forth. And yes, we've got tough things that perhaps it's hard to swallow in this part of the world. However, it's really important to build that solid foundations of parents with love, not with hate and fear of religion. That's going to deter your children away. That's going to make them say yes and cross those boundaries. Whereas if you can build that solid foundation of love and confidence in their religion and their faith, for example, when we talk about women empowerment, and that's the thing, right? Feminism and women empowerment. We don't, as Muslims, we don't need to talk about feminism when Islam gives us our women's rights, and we have the best of examples. For example, Sayyidah Khadija alayha salam, boss woman galore. You've got Sayyidah Fatima, who spoke up against injustice from the same people who were oppressing her. And you have Sayyidah Zainab alayhi salam, who again, from her mother and her grandmother, took their strength with the voice of her father, the words of her father, and stood up against the time, and tyrants of the time rather, who were oppressive and were tyrants against her and her family. And was it not, and this is something for young women to be absolutely proud of, that had it not been for Sayyidah Zainab, you wouldn't be wearing your hijab today. She saved the religion of Islam. So is that not something to be proud of in terms of, look at who I have as a role model? We don't need to adhere and assimilate and lose ourselves in a society around us where being undressed is something to be proud of. Whereas the epitome of a covered woman of her time, as Sayyidah Zainab, showed what true power and strength was all about, but by observing her modesty and her words and her hijab in a time that was dominated by men, that was predominantly a patriarchal society and very tribal and warlike, right? So again, when we look at crossing boundaries, I think we have a lot of work as parents and elders in the community to show pride and love in terms of what we have, teach that, instill that love and pride in our young youth and children. So when they get to the age where they have to make these decisions, they know their boundaries. They know how to set their boundaries and open up their boundaries, know when to say no, know when to say yes when it's right for them.
Thank you for that very, very well thought out answer. I do think it's extremely important, and it's very true that we do act differently depending on our different groups and affiliations and the different circles that we belong in, and that we adopt the influences of those that are around us. So for example, I can relate to a lot of what you just spoke about, and coming from a high school where I saw a lot of different people from different backgrounds, but also a lot of different Muslims, that like I heard what they talked about, I saw the different things that they did. And it wasn't until I was able to, when I was in college, that I finally got like a really like solid group of Muslim girls that I was able to become a community and a part of that. And it's really like those group of people that helped me determine like my own like self-worth and my own identity and how I can like wear those and keep those values and learn like how not to compromise. And I saw that through the Muslim Student Association at my own school, that I was able to have this very solid support system. And I wanted to ask you—
respect that, Melanie. People respect that.
Yeah.
Like when you set those boundaries, they respect that you have something that you stand for and you won't back down. That, I don't know if you've heard of the story, I don't know if it was real or not, but there was a group of businessmen and a Muslim business person doing business. And so when they met at the restaurant working out this deal, they agreed on it. The non-Muslims brought alcohol to seal the deal. Yet the Muslim put his boundaries out there, very respectfully explaining why he will not be able to participate, but also not be at the table. This made them accept the deal because of how he stood for his beliefs. Absolutely.
Yes, of course. They can, that's what they can't take away from you. I want to ask you another question. What are the psychological implications of not acting upon our beliefs?
I feel like I'm talking far too much in this. I'm just so passionate about this topic. And this answer, khair inshallah, thank you, Sheikh, for the support. I think what happens here, it has a lot to do with our guilt and our shame. And it may not come out at first. Again, I'll go back to that example of the brother who was telling everybody, don't let Berak know that I went to this party and then I got drunk and I knocked out in the closet. That's exactly what happened. Don't tell Berak. What does that mean? There's a sense of shame and guilt that he did not want a fellow Muslim that he respected to know what he had done, right? So when you are not acting upon your beliefs, absolutely, perhaps not at first, but then there does come this sense of shame, this sense, that part of yourself, and we call that in psychology the id, and it's part of, it's very similar to what we have, the 3 phases of the nafs, and mutma'inna, I always forget them, of course. I studied this and I have a model on it and I completely forget when the time I need. So help me out here. So nafs al-mutma'inna, nafs al-lawama, wa nafs what's the third one?
Ammara.
Al-ammara, ahsantu. So the ammara here is telling you, or the lawama is telling you rather about this guilt that you're doing something, right? And again, this is something that, subhanAllah, that is intrinsic and it's very natural within us, that when you are off course, that part of yourself is telling you, and we call it the super ego here, before you get to the ego, or the id rather, which is do what you want, to heck with the consequences, right? That super ego, the lawama is telling you, hold on, you got to think about your choices here. What is the right thing for you? What's going to help you? And so this self-talk is going to lead you, if you do go to the ammara self, the id in psychology, that can potentially lead to different states such as anxiety and depression. Because then let's say that guilt comes back and it just keeps coming back again and again, just ruminating in your head, so to speak, or other people perhaps remind you, or there's a consequence to your action that could be long-term impactful, whether it's, let's say people recorded you at this party and all of a sudden it's on social media. Not only does your family and community see it, but people at work saw you behaving this way. People nowadays can access anything. They can access all sorts of things about you that you think is not out there. In fact, employers use social media as a research tool to find out about their potential employees. What does that tell you, right? So anything's accessible out there. So there are consequences like that. And we go to the psychological consequences here. Like we said, definitely anxiety, and it could also cause depression. So for example, if you are crossing the line or doing something that is not in line with our beliefs, you can potentially find yourself isolated if, let's say, you're shunned by the community, right? You're not accepted, but also internally as well. If that waswas, the anxious thoughts, the constant worrying, and the berating of the guilt comes back and again telling you, what did you do? How could you do that? And so on and so forth. That isolation can also pull you away, right, from the community, from your activities. I hear a lot of people who, let's say, are not acting upon their faith as they once were because of very traumatic incidences like abusive marriages or incidences from family or, you know, anything like that. They feel that their faith has been shaken. They are not the same level of taqwa as they were before. And I hear comments from them such as, you know, I'm not worthy of reading poetry in the name of Ahlul Bayt like I used to. I'm not worthy of reciting. I've heard this from people. I'm not worthy of this hijab. I'm thinking about, you know, taking it off, God forbid. I haven't prayed as much as I used to. These are common things that I hear from friends, from people who reach out, support from social media, or other people are referred to, and even my own clients at the university, Muslim or people of faith, where they express this type of disgust with themselves or this vulnerability. And of course, we're not in a position to judge. Who am I to judge, right? Who are we to judge? As a counselor, I'm here to support and listen and not judge. And that's one of the worst things we can do. And we do this in our community. I think we are the ones who are pretending to be God, astaghfirullah, by judging people. That's not our role. Our role is absolutely to do nahi anil munkar wa amr bil ma'ruf, but there are also rules around how to do that tactfully, tastefully, discreetly, in a supportive manner, not in a judgmental manner, which it can easily be like that. And I think I've been guilty of that in the past when I've spoken very harshly when it comes to hijab and fashion hijab and the lack of modesty and how it's just become a clown show out there of women who are not observing their hijab in a respectful manner. I've learned how to be a little bit more diplomatic with that, but sometimes enough is enough. We have to take back our narrative too when we're seeing that there's a mockery done of these things. But specifically, again, back to this question here, when we are struggling with the guilt and shame of our actions, this again, leading to the description of how I've heard from people, how they've interacted with this, they lose confidence in themselves, right? They start their identities, it starts to erode, they start questioning, like I said, am I worthy enough to do this? I don't feel like I'm good enough to do this, right? As they're trying to please other people, to fit in, to be accepted, they forget that they're supposed to be pleasing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And long term, this will come back and haunt people. Interestingly enough, I've seen with clients at the university who, let's say, are Muslims who've come in, and I'll give you a hypothetical scenario, which is all too often something I see where young women and men perhaps partake in substance use, such as alcohol or marijuana, which is commonly used amongst university students and college students, either as a form of helping them de-stress, which is a very unhealthy way. And we know, of course, it crosses our moral compass. Now, what happens here is a lot of these young people don't do well in school. They come in struggling because of substance abuse. They're failing. Some of them are international students and they're wasting, so to speak, their parents' high-earned money, and international student fees are ridiculously high. And they don't think they're going to pass the term. And so when they come in and they see a counselor who looks Muslim, of course, they're terrified when they first see that. They're going to say, oh God, what, she's going to know all the haram that I've done. And it's somewhat funny, but you know, haram, you know, oh, poor person. So anyhow, so you bring them in and I don't even address the faith issue, the Islamic, nothing. And so slowly, you know, things start coming out and you stick to the professionalism of what you're doing. I find at the end of these sessions, people come back and say, you know, I used to pray. I've stopped praying. And so my response would be like, well, how does that make you feel? What do you want to do about that? Say, well, this comes, of course, after we looked at how to get the grades back up, how to make sure their parents don't find out, let's say, about the other stuff they don't want them to know about, but to help them, support them and connect them with the appropriate support services on campus. We solve the problems of what brought them in. SubhanAllah, they naturally come back and open up and say these things. And so I bring it into the therapy and say, well, what would you like to do about that? I never suggest, oh, you should pray. That's not how it works. You can't, as a counselor, you cannot impose what you believe on to others, much less faith, right? And so you bring it in very delicately, say, well, what would you like to do about that? Like, I want to pray more. oh, would you like to incorporate that into our treatment, into our therapy, in terms of accountability, in terms of spiritual activities that you can do that would make you feel better? Because usually most of the time they say, when I read the Quran, or when I start to do the prayers, or when I try to get my prayers in during the day, I feel better. So naturally you go with what makes them feel better with this, right? And so alhamdulillah, over time, the acts that they have not done with the beliefs, they slowly start bringing them back into their daily lives in a very healthy manner, in a delicate manner, in a non-judgmental way, because a lot of people judge themselves. You know, this is where that anxiety comes in as well, the guilt, because they start hating on themselves. They've become very harsh on themselves as well. And sometimes, you know, we could say you need that little bit of a push. You need a little bit of a wake-up call, absolutely. But then when you are so judgmental and so hating on yourself, that's a lot of negative energy. It's a lot of negative energy to work with. That's not going to be very productive, right? And so we want to do what the prophetic tradition of is tafa'alu bil khair tajidu, right? Put that positivity out there, propagate it, you will find it. And it's so powerful. And then also what Imam Ali alayhi salam says, and I use these concepts in my therapy when we talk about Islamic counseling, when we talk about therapy, and even just the language of this with people of faith, they get it, is that, or rather the prophetic tradition, that prevention is better than the cure, right? And we look at preventative matters of how to help people not fall into these traps, whether it's faith, whether it's morals, whether it's the law, right? Because people break the law too, and then that also gets them in different types of trouble, so that we can avoid these psychological challenges that come when they do cross the line.
Thank you, Sister Berak. On the note of crossing the lines and when not to cross it, I did have a very juicy question for Sheikhna. I had sort of a real life scenario. What would you do if your friend of the opposite gender, they wanted to hang out alone? And sometimes you may just fall into the trap of saying, oh, we're just friends and there's no harm in this. But I wanted to ask you, what would you do in this situation?
Yeah, so I never had that problem.
No, we're not after
I don't
the
know.
problem.
I don't know. No. In all honesty, let me address that from maybe a little more general perspective, and then get to sort of the matter at hand, or the question specifically as it's posed. And I wanted to mention that if there are people out there, and I know there are some questions coming in, and not only for Sister Berak, but for myself as well, that please do share your questions. And I'm sure even if we can't get to them online, that offline we'll make an attempt to at least answer some of those questions. So let me say this, that one day it is reported that somebody asked, I believe, Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salatu wassalam. He said, how do I know if God loves me? And so Imam Ali alayhi salam, I believe it was our Imam Ali who said this, that he said, ask yourself first, how much do you love God? And he says, you'll have the answer then of what God feels towards you in the sense of this love. And why do I mention this? Because in the end, it comes down to love. It comes down to who do we love above everything else. Either we have love of God, love of something that is supreme and divine and higher than us, in terms of not only our devotion and how we live our lives, but certainly the boundaries and limits that are set for us, and live by that higher code. Or it's that we live for everything that just pleases me. And the nafs al-ammara that was mentioned so nicely by Sister Berak, that this is constantly there beckoning and calling us. And so what do we do? So prior to answering the question or the scenario that faces us, where a young person is invited by somebody of the opposite gender to hang out, and there is nothing intended other than friendship and nothing beyond that, we ask ourselves the question of what precedes that, what comes before that, and how do we ensure from a religious perspective that if a circumstance like that comes to us, if we face a circumstance like that, that we're going to behave in the way that Allah wants us to behave, and that we are not going to fall at risk of committing something that we don't want to commit? Well, it begins again by answering the question, who do we love? Do we love God? Are we servants of God, or are we servants of everything other than God? Have we enslaved ourselves to the world and to our desires, or have we become the slaves of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? The second thing is our practice. And I think we've talked about that how do you act in such a manner such that when you come into those circumstances, you know automatically, even though you're tempted, even though shaitan is in your ear, that the decision you're going to make is going to be the right decision. Well, it comes with practice. It has to be with practice. None of us is born sort of having all knowledge, all self-control, having absolute purity such that every circumstance will be able to identify shaitan or the slippery slope and immediately move away from it. No, it's not that easy. That's what makes us fallible, is that we don't see clearly. And when we encounter the circumstance that is potentially dangerous, we don't always know how to navigate it such that we steer clear of it in a very sort of firm and a sort of obvious or overt manner. And so it comes with practice. It has to be practice. I remember, and I'm sure you all have the same sort of experiences, that my mother, and indeed my father as well, but my mother particularly, may Allah have mercy on her soul, she always reminded me, particularly when I went off to college. So I went away to college, and I went to, I hate to admit it, it was known as like one of the party schools in the United States, the University of Florida. I'm a proud Florida Gator. So it was known as a party school. And so my mother sent me off. She trusted in what she had inculcated into me, but she said to me, make sure that you pray on time. I'm not going to say anything else to you. Pray on time. And so I would say that for all of us, if we can hold on to that practice to begin with, start consciously praying on time. What it will do is awaken an awareness of God inside of us, such that if my mind is aware to the fact that adhan has gone, time for prayer has set in, and I must pray, then when I face a circumstance in which I'm at risk of falling away from his religion or breaking his limits, that awareness will immediately click in my mind. The light will flash inside my head. It is practice. Human beings are creatures of habit and practice. So start with praying on time. Just begin with that. Number two, Quran. Holy Quran is the gift of God to humanity. And that, I even say this to my own children, that read at least one line a day. Fine, you're too busy, you've got school, other things. No one's saying that you need to finish an entire juz or an entire section in one night. No, at least read one line. Why? Because if you read one line, and in addition to reading that one line, focus on its meaning, you have now put something in the register inside of your mind. And you've got now something to refer back to. And believe me, if you read just that one line with a little bit of focus, and you don't have to memorize it, know the meaning of each word in that verse, believe me, it will stay in there and it will never leave. It will never leave. But what we do is, no, you got to go and read a whole 10 pages of the Holy Quran when it's finals week. Or you've got to go read the whole juz of the Quran when you've got a deadline at work. No, Allah doesn't say that you have to be this way. Allah knows how we live our lives. He says, be practical, use your time and understand what your mind and what your body needs. And so do so incrementally, but putting it into practice. And then when you do that, the more you learn, study, know the boundaries of your religion. When you get to that question of, well, let's hang out and have dinner together, or let's go out and hang out after school, and my friend or companion who's asking me to do so is of the opposite gender, you know what the answer is going to be. So what is the answer from a religious perspective? Well, a man and a woman who are غير mahram to each other and are not married, there is no prohibition of them being in the company of each other per se. Meaning a man and woman can talk to each other, can be in each other's company. What is problematic is what can exist between them if the conversation goes in a direction that it should not go into, or emotions and temptation enters into the picture. And so when you talk about somebody from the opposite gender coming to you and saying, let's hang out after school. And in fact, I had a young man come and ask me this question that, well, she's just a friend of mine. Nothing happened. We're not going to do anything. We're just friends. I said, I trust you. God knows who you are, that nothing's going to happen. But that's not the point. The point is you're human, that you have feelings inside of yourself. And you have this major enemy sitting there, the shaitan, waiting to jump on you. And his greatest strength is that he'll catch you when you're not paying attention. When you are paying attention and you fight him off and ward him off, you think he's going to leave and not come back? No, he's going to wait till the next moment that he can grab you. And then you'll find yourself sort of tempted again. And maybe this time you won't be able to hold on. So the answer to that question is, why would you put yourself into a circumstance or into a position in which you are going to be at risk of committing a sin? You don't want to be in that circumstance. You want to steer clear of that circumstance. That's why to build self-control is not easy. I said it already, that it's about practice, but it's also about self-discipline, right? It's also about me restricting myself. In another reported hadith from Imam Sadiq alayhi salatu wassalam, that when the man said to him that I have these habits that I can't control, I do these things and I'm just not able to control myself. I'm not able to stop myself. What should I do? His answer was quite simple. He said, control what you eat. Begin by controlling what you eat. Start with the most rudimentary of things and instill some discipline in your life. And you will find that if you begin with the small things, the bigger things will come. That's why you see our the A'imma al-Athhar alayhim as-salatu was-salam, the Ahl al-Bayt, the prophets and the messengers. Do you not think that they could have eaten the best of foods, all of it being halal, being permissible, living a high life, a comfortable life? They could have, but they did not. Why? Because even that may be a door to giving importance to something other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Even in a more real world situation, the Maraja, our great jurists who live these pious, simple lives, men who don't care about the collections of this world or the wealth of this world, look at how they live. They eat the most basic thing. And even though it is permissible for them to eat a little extra or to engage in a little extra comfort, they don't do so. Why? Because that may be a door that opens to something else, maybe something else that is halal and permissible, but God forbid it may open up to something that is impermissible and prohibited. And the problem is we don't see that. We just see, yes, let's consume, let's take and please ourselves to the nth degree, but we don't see what lies beyond the door of that nth degree. We don't see the potential risk. Some of that comes with knowing who we are as the creatures of God and understanding that. So in all honesty, why put yourself at risk? Why put yourself into a circumstance where potentially you could even have a bad thought in your mind, knowing what you are and who you are, and engage in those small things that give you strength and sort of the ability to hold on to the tenets of your religion and the rules. Really, I wish I could say there's an easy way, but that's the struggle of being human. It's the struggle of the path to God. And it's the only way that we can really find elevation in the eyes of Allah.
I do think how we put our beliefs into practice is perhaps the most challenging part of this entire discussion. In order to move on, I wanted to bring up another point, part of our acronym, to never compromise on our beliefs. And how do we not cut corners, and how do we stay within our own beliefs instead of giving in? And perhaps giving in is the easiest part, but how do we stay strong? How do we never compromise? So I have another question for Sheikhna. How do we balance expectations and carry out our religious symbols or identity?
Could you repeat that, Melanie, one more time?
How do we balance our expectations while also carrying out our religious symbols and identity?
Yeah, so that's so tough because we want to be the professionals and the successful in the world, right? I mean, that, and again, I think if we could see what's waiting us beyond the veil of this world, I think most of us would treat it like the carcass that Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wasallam treated this world as, that its worth is less than this dying, rotting body of the animal on the side of the road. some of it comes to that. And the only way to establish that or to reconcile these two conflicting ways of life is by understanding and giving perspective to things. I think one of the practical ways is to see how the other world lives. I'll give you an example. When the tsunami struck in Banda Aceh in Indonesia many years ago, that devastating tsunami that struck, there was a story about a fisherman named Muhammad. And they say he was out, he had gone out in the morning early. He had a rickety old boat to catch the fish, and he would come back in the mid-morning, have his tea. It just so happened he went out and he basically went out, tried to catch fish, couldn't catch his fish, came back. When he brought the boat back up onto the shoreline, the tsunami struck and his boat was devastated. It was a rickety old boat anyways, poor fisherman. And he describes later on, he's being interviewed after the aftermath of this calamitous event. He was being interviewed and asked about what happened, how he felt, etc. He looked so dejected. And the journalist asked what happened. He said that I came back to the shore, the big giant waves struck, the tsunami struck, destroyed the boat. And this is the source of my livelihood. My wife, my children, they depend on it. I have little children. I have to feed them. And this little boat, destroyed. Now I have no way of earning any money. And I sat there on the beach, just looking at the broken pieces of wood and feeling this great despair. He said, when I went back to my village, I found that my wife and my children all had perished in the tsunami. And when I saw that, that boat meant nothing to me. That boat was so insignificant that something so important, even more important, had been taken away from me. And I mention this because if we were to see the other world, if we were to see how dejected the lives of some people are, why? Because of lack of resources, lack of opportunity, marginalization in society, lack of health care, no options for education, particularly women who are not being given opportunities to become educated. And you see people living in war zones, orphans. We will sit in our lives, and if we really ponder on how much they're suffering, we'll put into context what's important and what's not important. And I think the youth of today need a very hard lesson in this, to be able to see this, that there is a part of the world that has nothing, that has less than nothing. And that if you really want something of value, forget about your iPhone, forget about your iPad, forget about how much time you get to spend with your friends. Think about the fact that you've been given something so valuable that someone else doesn't have it. They don't have what you have. That will make context a little more straightforward. It will open your eyes. But again, it requires an active process in which we're doing so.
Thank you. I wanted to ask our final question until we open it up to the question and answer for the audience. Thank you to everyone who's been submitting questions in the chat so far. Feel free to keep asking them. Sister Berak, how do we prevent outside pressures from taking us off our balance?
I love listening to what the Sheikh was saying. It really struck me in terms of the idea of what our goals are, essentially. What is our path? What do you choose, right? Is it this material world or is it the world later on? So essentially it comes down to what you want in this life. I'm part of this course that I joined for my own personal enrichment, and because it's so related to psychology, I can't help but pull some ideas out of that and extrapolate it here. And it's a course on the 40 hadiths, and one of the characteristics that really struck me had to do with death, and the idea that death is the ultimate and final potential that the human has to reach. And that hit me on so many levels, from a spiritual, religious, psychological, in the sense that our spirit is born into this world with so much potential. How do you choose to work with that potential? And ultimately, again, death is that point in our whole existence, in terms of our physical existence, in terms of what are you going to do until that point, because whatever potential you reach at that point is the final irreversible point in your life before you head on to the next path. And so that is something we talk about a lot in psychology in terms of what are your goals? What do you hope to achieve? What do you want to do? And so when you apply it from a psychological perspective, this is where we can answer this question in terms of how do we prevent outside pressures from taking us off balance or off course, is to look at that question. What are your goals? So I put this question back to our audience members. What do you hope to achieve in this speck, in this blink of an eye lifetime that we have, which may seem like such a long time for us, could be 50, 60, 70 years. That could seem like a long time, but if we look back to how long people lived in the past, and we know this from Quranic traditions, they lived for thousands of years. Our lives, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, are nothing compared to that. What do you hope to achieve during this time? And I think this is where it's very important to define and look at our goals. Yes, Allah is the ultimate planner, but we plan and we put our trust in him and move forward. So it could come to planning for what you want to study, university and college, what you want to do in a career, what do you look for in a partner, what do you hope to achieve in your career goals moving forward, but also from a spiritual religious perspective, how do you want to move forward there? What are your goals there? We can't just live floating mindlessly or like the leaves on a tree. It doesn't work that way. I mean, unless you are an actual hippie that's living, with no rules and just living like that, you'll be completely lost, right? So it's really important that we teach.
I tried it doesn't work.
It doesn't work. You tried the hippie life, Sheikhna? I think that's why you turned to the life of the scholarly Sheikh, right? And science, it gave you that discipline and routine. And naturally, we are inclined towards that. Children need that routine and that discipline and the routine. Like it's so important to have that. And the Sheikh was talking about that earlier in terms of practicing and whatnot. And there's the science behind that, the psychology and the research behind that shows. And some research shows 21 days. We know Islamically it's around 40 days, right? That when you practice something for a certain amount of time, for 21 days, it becomes a good or bad habit. Islamically, it's 40 days, right? So it's fascinating to see that when we adhere to our routine, our discipline, looking at what our goals are, and again, in all areas of life, we make the plan for what it could look like a year from now, 5 years. Although right now in the pandemic, we don't know what's going to happen. A lot of us had plans, whether it's weddings or travels. I canceled so many travels. I miss traveling. I used to travel once a month. It's all canceled. But we planned, but Allah's the ultimate planner. Regardless of that, you still plan and go ahead and work hard towards those goals with the best of the resources and abilities that you have, and keep going that way. And again, using the positive influences around you. For example, these wonderful programs that the Marja'iyya is now doing in terms of combining psychology, mental health, wellness, and Islam in a way that is practical for us to understand, right? Looking at people who are positive influencers, whether they're scholars, whether they're scientists, whether they're public figures that have meaningful influence, positive influences on you. These are positive outside pressures or influences, I would say, that you can incorporate and apply. And then if you find yourself lost, like the hippie, or you find yourself off track, that's normal too. That is also an indicator if you're feeling anxious, if you're feeling concerned, if you're feeling sad, if you're feeling off track, if you're feeling physically unwell. This is your body's way of telling you, hey, slow down, get yourself checked out. We have to listen to the signs and the symptoms of our bodies, whether it's physical, behavioral, mental, or I missed one of them, behavioral, then it's your body's way of trying to catch your attention that something is off track, that these outside pressures are impacting you. You need to listen. Just like you get the notifications on your phone, your brain is sending you notifications, your body's sending you notifications. You need to listen. Your spirit is sending you notifications when you're having these three parts of your nafs in battle with that constant jihad in nafs. We need to listen to that inner struggle, because it means that the outside pressures are impacting you, and we need to listen to realign ourselves, whether it means getting your eating back on track. If during the pandemic you've been eating off track, which is a normal thing to have done considering our circumstances. Exercise, getting back into good physical health, right? Whether it's losing weight or toning up, whatever it is, because again, this has thrown us off track during the pandemic, right? Making sure your sleep is on track. Basic small things that when you work on building these small things, eating, sleeping, exercise, which is part of your basic wellness, then you can work on the deeper stuff when it comes to spirituality, when it comes to relations with your family and relationships and communication and your work, right? So again, the short answer to the long answer that I gave is to be aware of your mind, your body, your spirit. Look at how you're responding to these outside pressures. It's normal to have stress in your life. What's not normal is when you don't take care of that stress, after you keep ignoring the notifications that your whole being is trying to tell you, or perhaps friends are telling you, or family. And if you are off track, come talk to a therapist, talk to a sheikh, talk to somebody who can help you realign yourself to look at what is off track here. And that's essentially a lot of the work that I do at the university level with students who are fallen off track, and look at how to get back on track. And that way they take control over things that are a little bit out of control, right? Again, essentially here, when we look at goals in terms of trying to achieve our goals, looking at who we can work with, who we can help or get help from to get ourselves back on track. Of course, the ultimate in terms of helping us is going to be Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, especially when we're spiritually aligned. Now, a lot of us may not be spiritually aligned, and I just wanted to show, I didn't get a chance earlier to screenshot it and put it, but I will quickly bring it up here and bring it up on screen. Enlight Media, I'm sure you're familiar with it, which is the channel that Hajj Hassan and Rajab Ali works on. And so they had earlier posted something that I connect with so much as a psychotherapist, but it talks about spirituality. So I'm going to bring it up to the screen here, and hopefully, yes, you can see it. Can you see it? The reflection's not too bad there. Okay, so essentially what you see is that your spirituality does not go up like this. It's not a linear thing. Neither is your growth, neither is your wellness and your mental health. It's not a straight line like that. We tend to think that it is, but it's not. It looks like this. Essentially, it looks like that. That is our path. You're going to have challenges, as you can see here. You're going to have challenges. You're going to have people in the way. You're going to have growth. You're going to have setbacks. It is never a straight line, never. And I learned this years ago from a sheikh when we were having discussions on spirituality. And as a psych student, I'm like, you know, this is perfectly in line with what we do. So when those pressures hit you, recognize that it's okay, that, you know, it's up and down, up and down. What's really nice from a psychological perspective is that when you've gone through a difficulty and you've learned strategies, you've reached out and gotten support, and Allah has helped you, and whether it's using the Quran, whether it's using our faith, and whether it's using psychology or whatever around you to help you, the next time you fall back down, you're actually higher up than when you first started, right? Unless it's a completely different scenario. But here, what happens is resilience. You've learned from these outside pressures, right? And you learn how to put yourself back in balance. And that's normal, and that's okay. And especially now during the pandemic, where we have been completely off balance, I think it's really important to exercise self-compassion as well. Is that you are going through a global pandemic. It's not just you alone. People have lost lives. People are not the same after catching this virus and heading back to normal, so to speak. What is normal, right? I mean, this is the perfect example when we take a look at outside pressures. This has really, really tested us, right? We are like the dough of the bread that were being kneaded from all directions. And that spirituality chart right there is very much applicable here. We've been tested in so many different ways that, at least in our lifetime, we've never experienced before. How do we get back on track? Well, as psychotherapists and people in mental health and psychology, we have been going crazy, pardon the pun, trying to figure out the answer to that, because even as we are trying to help others, we are trying to figure out how to find this type of balance, because we've never experienced that. What we do know, though, subhanAllah, from research, that it takes around 3 months, around 90 days or so, for people to reach that place of balance and resilience. That may seem like a long time, but think back to when the pandemic first happened. It was very offsetting at first. People were laid off, businesses started getting closed. Like there was a lot of fear around that, and people started buying toilet paper of all things, right? As Muslims, we didn't have to worry about that. We did not worry about that. But also at the same time, it took a while for us to figure things out, whether it's working from home, studying from home. And now, you know, we're going to have a year and a half of studies online, at least at our university. Here in Canada, I know in the States it's quite different. Even in the UK, I think it's similar to Canada because they're in a lockdown as we are right now. I mean, look at us. We're doing this program. Perhaps perhaps I would have been in Dearborn doing this program at the center. Who knows, right? But right now we're doing all of these types of programs online. We've adjusted. It's still very challenging because we're social creatures, right? We are used to interacting. Shahr Ramadan, I don't think we've ever experienced such a month like that before, at least for the most part for people. But those people who are sick, let's say, who are elderly or can't come, now we know how they feel. Now we know how converts feel when they've been isolated and alone during Shahr Ramadan, for example. Muharram. This year, Muharram was quite challenging for a lot of communities, right? And so Arba'een, let's not even go there, where a lot of us could not go. I'm one of them, you know, and it was very challenging. So these outside pressures have taught us so many things in terms of how we adjust, how we plan, how we work with the resources around us, and it shows our resilience at the same time. Alhamdulillah.
Thank you. That was very beautiful and very insightful. I wanted to move on to some questions and answers from the audience. Thank you to everyone who submitted. We got many and you can keep them coming. Hopefully we'll be able to touch on a few of them. There was one I really wanted to ask. It was very relatable from the audience. What are some practical ways we can deal with the guilt that we may carry, and how do we learn to develop self-worth?
Sheikhna, you go for it. I already said some stuff about that. Your turn.
I'm not sure I'm qualified to say something about that.
From a spiritual perspective.
Let me preface the answer that we should be very careful. I know as ulama or as religious scholars and people who are sort of sought after in the communities for the solutions of their problems, there are limitations. We are not mental health specialists, nor should we act in that capacity, nor should we be giving the advice that falls into the realm of psychiatry or psychology or mental health. I say that very clearly because I know nothing about it. I can speak from the perspective of religion and faith and personal experience more than anything else. And what is told to us, what is spoken to us by the Ahl al-Bayt alayhim as-salatu was-salam. And in fact, the very nice thing that you mentioned about the trajectory of faith, it is in fact a hadith from Imam as-Sadiq alayhi salatu was-salam, that when a man asked that what is faith, is it just what you proclaim from your mouth or is it your action? Imam as-Sadiq alayhi salatu was-salam, it is reported, he answered that it is different circumstances, it is different conditions, if it is different moments, it goes up and down constantly. And so it's certainly, from the religious perspective, something that we need to consider very deeply. Guilt, I say this, that some people, when they ask me, guilt is a good thing. It means your heart is alive. You want to be worried when your heart is not alive. You want to be worried when you don't have a conscience. And that conscience is what Allah has given to you as a security blanket almost. And so how do you reconcile any amount of guilt? And how do you ensure that it doesn't become negative? I can't answer that from a mental health perspective. But I can say that that's why Allah has put us between two positions. بين الخوف والرجاء. We are between fear and hope. We must have enough fear of God that we will not transgress his limits, but enough hope in him such that we know that he will forgive us. And so neither one should be an excuse for deviating, nor should be it an excuse for us feeling crushed and overwhelmed because of our lives. It should be a reason for evolution. And when I say evolution, I mean spiritual evolution. I mean the improvement of an individual. And it means that constantly seeking improvement. There is no point to guilt if you don't improve. There is no point to saying sorry if you're not going to change. And that applies to God as well. If you say sorry to God and you don't change, what is the point in saying sorry? Imagine a human being in front of you whom you did wrong to, you say sorry to them, and a day later you go back and do the same thing to them. How do you think they will take it? Now imagine it is Allah you are transgressing against. It's just that simple. And that's what we have to keep in our minds.
Can I just quickly answer that from a psychological perspective with a resource that I actually have here because I'm working from home, so I have them here. This is an excellent book called the Self-Esteem Workbook by Dr. Shiralde. I've had this book for a long time now, and I've used it up quite a bit with my clients and students and even friends who ask this question in terms of self-worth and self-esteem. And this is an excellent resource. It's a workbook. It builds on the foundations that we connect with as Muslims as well, where it takes a look at how to understand your self-esteem, where you're at, taking care of your eating, sleeping, exercise, that type of thing. And it works on this model when we look at worth. Just quickly, I'll show you the picture because it's very straightforward and answers the question of worth. Of course, now that I want it, I can't find it, but it's essentially the last ship on, where is it? It's the idea of building, there it is. It's building of your unconditional worth first. I'll put it right here. You see it? So building your unconditional worth, love, growth. And what happens is when these foundations are in fair balance, they don't have to be 100%, of course. That's when you have a balanced sense of self-esteem. How do you work on that? Well, as you saw, the building blocks, it takes a bit of time, right? And essentially it's this idea here, which I also, depending on Muslims or faith-based clients, this concept right here is incredibly powerful when we look at worth, is that your worth as an individual, as a person, is completely independent of external factors. The list goes on in terms of what external factors are, as you can see here. And if you apply this from a spiritual perspective, your worth is completely independent of this material world, of people, except your connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
He's the one who gives you. He's the one who gives you the worth. No human being.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we are all about running after pleasing people, impressing people, and wanting their acceptance. And it's normal because we're human and we crave that acceptance, right? But in the end, when you put your worth dependent upon your taqwa and your relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, these things kind of melt away. And when you can work and build on that, it's so incredibly powerful. So I highly recommend this resource for those who are asking in terms of how to work on your sense of worth, your sense of self-esteem. This is a wonderful resource that I've been using for years with people. You can find it online as well. And it's very helpful to build that sense of self. And it talks a lot about the things that we discussed today as well. It's very holistic as well.
Thank you both for your very wholesome answers. I definitely think that out of everyone we know, all of our friends, all of our relationships, God is our best friend. He's the one who understands us better than ourselves, better than anyone. And to sort of summarize what we spoke about so far, I wanted to share this very special graphic that our graphics team put together for us. And I hope everyone can see this. This is sort of a summary of all of our points and this acronym to remember and implement everything that we spoke of tonight, to identify the positive and negative influences around us and to be aware of both of them so that we can properly navigate those influences and how they impact us, to maintain our identity as a Muslim, to act according to our own beliefs and our religious responsibilities to ourselves, to others, and to constantly keep that alive throughout and to build and improve our own self-worth, and to never compromise upon our values. And no matter what kind of situation or circles that we're in, whether it be professional or in an academic setting, to really hold on to them and not trade them for any other beliefs. And with that, I would like to move on to another audience question. How do you deal with loneliness that comes with setting your boundaries? Having mental health issues makes it so much harder to accept losing friends when being firm in decision-making. It makes you feel worthless and like you deserve to be alone and that no one else exists who can help you.
Bless you. Oh man, that deserves a whole session sessions. Like that's not something that I can answer very quickly, but essentially it comes back to what we were talking about. Your worth is not dependent upon these people around you. And I know it could be very hard because you want to be accepted, you want to be loved, you want to be part of this social circle, and that's normal, that's natural. However, let's look at it from a psycho-spiritual perspective. Perhaps you've cut off these people or they've cut you off. If you can learn to reframe that from this perspective, that perhaps Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was protecting you from these toxic people, that in itself will reduce the anxiety and stress from the situation. That is, if you can connect with this idea from a spiritual, psycho-religious point of view. Perhaps, and I don't know the person obviously who asked this question, where they stand, but this is how I would answer this question when talking to somebody who does adhere to faith and spirituality. If you can reframe the situation that God has gotten rid of these toxic people that are a negative influence on you, that are only going to hurt you in the long run, then you know what? This is helpful. If you don't want to use, let's say, the religious aspect of it, I will still say the same thing and say the universe has gotten rid of these toxic people around you in a way that you were not even aware of, that you don't really need. Now, when it comes to loneliness, and again, this is something that we deal with a lot, especially with international students who are coming here, especially during this pandemic right now. We have students who are coming in from different provinces who are different, not with their families. They don't you can't socialize the same way. It's very hard when you cut off or you have your social circle of some kind of support cut off. And this type of mentality where we want to stay with the toxic person is very much in line with women who stay in abusive marriages and relationships. They feel that nobody else is going to love them. They have no other choice, that this is the best it can be for them. This is what they deserve. And it's such a, what's the word I'm looking for? It's a fallacy in terms of thinking that way. But when you are in such a toxic relationship or environment or situation, this is how our brain works, unfortunately. It's been wired because of the toxicity. So this requires time, work in terms of working with somebody who can help you change that mentality. And there are people who can do it like that in terms of, you know what, I'm done with this toxic energy. Perhaps they're no longer in my life for a good thing. I can tell you, as a therapist and as somebody who's been blessed with a few more years of wisdom in terms of experience with people, relationships, getting to know people in life, and the situations I see around me, it's a good thing when these people are no longer in your life. It is a blessing in disguise. God did in fact take them out of your life for a reason, right? He's put them in your life, and I'm sure you've heard this before, for a reason, a lesson, or a season. And I believe for all of the above. They are there for a lesson. They could be there only for a season, but the reason is for you to learn and grow from that. Now, in terms of feeling lonely, there are different ways of connecting, perhaps online, because that's the medium we have right now, perhaps, depending where you are in the world, with positive influences of people. There are wonderful groups out there who, and I say this from what I've seen of groups of people coming out, reaching out, saying, oh, we have a sisters group. Oh, we have a youth group. Can you come and talk to us about this, this, and that? So I know these groups exist. There are study groups. For example, Al Mizan Institute is doing a new course right now, and they put all of us in a group. And it's so great to connect with sisters that I haven't seen in person that I'm used to seeing. So these are small examples of how you can interact with different people who were once you were surrounded by negative, toxic people, is to redirect that energy now to finding different sources of support. And this is a tenet, I would say, like a fact that I've seen over and over again. Sometimes we don't get the support from the people we want the most and we expect it the most from, which could also be family. And sometimes we get support and love and connections from the least of people that we expect out there, or different resources and so on and so forth. So it's really important. Alhamdulillah, we say, when we've gotten rid of these toxic energies around us. It's hard to see it at first, but in retrospect, we can see that we are much better off without that toxic energy, without the pressure of the negativity of these people. But this requires work from you to be able to reframe that as a positive thing rather than a negative, and being able to put that energy now in a different direction for yourself, inshallah.
I know that the audience is really benefiting, and I can speak for myself because the question of toxic people, it's like such a question that we're all dealing with constantly. And we did have a follow-up question that I want to ask. What if the toxic people in our lives are our families, especially during the pandemic now? It is so difficult to be firm against the people in our own houses. And our ummah is often unforgiving and unsympathetic towards people with toxic parents, siblings, or spouses.
Absolutely. And this is a challenge I've seen again and again. I don't have the answer for it. I'll give a few quick, short answers. This is something I see commonly. Even before the pandemic, I was seeing this regularly, where young people were living still at home, and some from Muslim families where there's abuse, there's toxicity, there's the overbearing parental dictatorship type of control, which is very common in some families. Essentially, what we want to do here is be able to put a barrier, an emotional barrier, meaning not allow yourself to get emotionally engaged. This is very challenging, but if you can work to master this skill, not just with the toxic people that you live, but anywhere around you, you're succeeding right there. What happens is you're learning how to regulate your emotions, not to take things too personally, which is nearly impossible when we're talking about your mother or your father or your sibling or your partner, even your child. And it's like I said, it's near impossible. But if you can work with that mentality of not taking it too personally, pushing, so putting this distance, okay, setting these boundaries, emotional boundaries of not allowing yourself to get emotionally engaged, meaning they say something to upset you, take 10 seconds breathing rather than instantly reacting. Because as human beings, when we are triggered with something of anger, it's normal to respond in anger with high emotions, because you're instantly, your amygdala and your hippocampus is just all of the brain and the executive functioning here is just turned off. It just goes like this, like you're flaring. There's no critical thinking. There's no baseline functioning at this point. What you want to do is take that slow breath to slow the heart rate down and respond in a way without high intense emotions. So separating your emotions, not emotionally getting engaged, not allowing yourself to take things too personally. Now, this can only work for a short period of time. Long-term strategies involve perhaps other interventions of family members, community members. When there's physical abuse, there is no tolerance and patience for that. We know this from a religious perspective. We know this from a spiritual and societal perspective. Any sheikh that you go to and says to you, be patient when you are being beaten, I'm sorry. They do not deserve the imam on their head, nor would the imams accept this type of answer, because they are breaking Islamic law, they're breaking human law when they raise their hand on you. This goes for both women and men, by the way, because we know it happens both ways. If this is the situation, then you need to reach out to a trusted scholar or sheikh in the community, an elder in the community, or even resources in the community that deal with domestic violence and abuse. Bottom line. That's how it works. Police may need to be involved as well when things get out of hand. And I say this from experience, not because I've been westernized and impacted by Western media and we've had to deal with this in our Muslim communities, where the sheikh said, you get the police involved when her brother is beating her and her parents can't do anything. Because, for example, the sheikh tried speaking to the brother and that person is just completely violent and out of hand. They said they need the authorities involved. So it can be very tricky, because the environment this person is speaking of could be just toxic and not necessarily physical, but then there's an answer for each of these types of scenarios in terms of how we deal with these situations. Patience definitely is an attribute that we need to apply in certain situations when there is the opportunity or chance for improvement, when there is a chance for a person to work on themselves, get support, whether it's anger management, parenting, and also the amazing classes and courses that our ulamas and our sheikhs and the different groups put together to help ourselves in that improvement. Again, the line that we cannot cross here, like red line, if there's violence, if there's abuse, there's no patience or tolerance accepted there. Now, on the flip side, I have seen where the person who had shown violence had changed their ways. I'm not saying it does not completely not exist. It does happen. But for the most part, we know that when women leave abusive households and there's no support in the community and she's forced to go back, we've seen cases, and recently 2 years ago in Toronto, where a Somali mother of 4 children left her abusive violent husband. There was no support and compassion and financial support from the community. She was forced to go back to her husband, who eventually killed her and the children. So these are the extremes of these types of situations that happen. And this is why it's important to work at from a holistic angle, whether it is the scholars, where it's the masjid, where it's the social services, the psychologists, or whoever is involved to help prevent these types of situations, because it can get from, you know, a simple toxic environment to much more complicated violent situations like this.
Thank you, Sister Berak. I know that we got many questions and some of them are very personal, and I wish that we could go through all of them, but I'm afraid that would take us all night and into tomorrow. So I would like to, if anyone has any closing remarks they would like to make before we move into our closing dua.
Can I just say, if anybody has any questions, please email them to us. You can catch us on our social media, our emails as well, especially when they're very specific. The Sheikh and I definitely want to be able to help you. It's just, it's hard when we don't know all the details. And then, then we have to go through all the scenarios. So please, if you do have specific personal questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us, whether email, you can find us on social media. We're tagged on the posters that you saw. And inshallah, we'll do our best to answer these types of questions, because I know a lot of people can benefit from them, but just for time. And inshallah, we'll have future sessions where we'll get more into these types of things.
Yeah, and in addition, thank you, Sister Berak, I'd like to just reiterate that the Marja'iyah's liaison office in North America is working towards providing these sorts of services and support, and really the types of education that we need. And so I would encourage you to ask your questions and raise up your comments and bring your concerns directly to us so that we can address them, and look for new material, new sorts of resources that are going to be available to help all of us grow and strengthen as Muslims in North America, because we're really, all of us are facing the same challenges. And so again, I encourage your feedback, your engagement, and as much as possible, reach out and keep the conversation going. And hopefully the graphic that Sister Melanie showed, the Iman graphic, is something that we want to build upon. And we want to use as a means by which we can strengthen our path on our religion, and not only in terms of our faithfulness to religion, but certainly how to be good citizens, how to be good neighbors, how to be people who contribute to the broader society, because that's the way of Islam. And it begins with us knowing ourselves and then sharing whatever goodness we have inside of ourselves with others, inshallah. And I can say for sure that despite the fact that Sister Berak is from Ottawa, I benefited a whole lot and really, really appreciated all of that. Toronto rules always.
Are we going there? Are we truly going there, Sheikhna? I love Toronto, by the way. I was a huge Maple Leaf fan, Toronto Blue Jays fan, recently Raptor. I absolutely was a Maple Leaf fan. Like, coming to Ottawa and having to like the Ottawa Senators was brutal. And we have worse weather here in Ottawa than we do in Toronto, which is almost spring-like there at times. But alhamdulillah wa shukr, it was a pleasure having this discussion with you, Sheikhna, even though you took it to that level of, you know, Ottawa, Toronto. That's okay. I forgive you.
Always personal. It's always personal.
It's a pleasure working with a fellow Canadian/American. I'm, by the way, American too. So, you know, the mix is all there, alhamdulillah. But again, we highly encourage our audience members. Inshallah, this is the first of many programs that we're going to be working together with the Marja'iyah. And I'm so proud of our Marja'iyah for taking the stance in terms of looking at these social issues from the psychological, the wellness, the mental health perspective. It's high time that we do that now, especially in order to foster the relationship with the Marja'iyah and the community, to foster that trust, to bring the youth back. And inshallah, for those of you who are watching, you can send us more suggestions of ideas of what you would like more for us to have these discussions on. And inshallah, we'll do our best to tackle them. And they're not easy. If you notice, like, we were supposed to finish almost half an hour ago, and it was a pleasure actually to go on more. And it just shows you the need of talking about these difficult situations. And I see questions here about hijab. job. I see questions here about behavioral issues at home, and the list can go on. And that's what we're here for, inshallah, to work together, to be able, and this is just the tip of the iceberg. This is just the intro pilot program, you could say, inshallah, for more to come, so that we can be of service to our communities, so that we can come together, support one another, and not isolate, not judge, and not push away, but rather do the opposite, especially in line with how the Prophet and the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam taught us how to be a community, how to work together, how to love and show compassion to those who are the vulnerable, and to bring them closer, inshallah.
Thank you. And with that, I would ask Sister Berak to lead us in a short dua whenever you're ready.
And what better dua than to complete it, inshallah, dua al-faraj of Imam al-Hujjah. So I ask you all to join in with this dua, inshallah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma kun li waliyika al-Hujjat ibn al-Hasan salawatuka alayhi wa ala abahi fi hadhihi as-sa'a wa fi kulli sa'a. وليا وحافظا وقائدا وناصرا ودليلا وعينا حتى تسكنه أرضك طوعا وتمتع فيها طويلا برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجه إن شاء الله.
Thank you so much.
Melanie, for the wonderful job you did. Couldn't have done it without you.
Thank you,
Melanie.
Thank you, Mom. Thanks, Sheikhna. Thank you, Sister Berak. Thank you for all of our audience members for sticking with us for this long. And thank you to everyone for listening on YouTube and all of our supporters. And I really want to apologize to everyone for all the questions that we weren't able to get to. I know they really made me think about a lot of insightful reflections. And thank you for all of your scenarios and all of your insightful advice. I hope that we can remember to follow our guidelines and never compromise in any of our beliefs. And with that, I would like to close our program. And thank you everyone for joining us. Hopefully this will be the first of many, inshallah.
Inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.